Both of you touched upon 2 points, which I thought were very interesting. Coming back to the humanitarian development nexus, is the design and the strategies that we put forward for services just is not to be short term, but we need to be looking at how those investments are also contributing to longer term effects. The other one is in relation to again, working together. And Tarat, you mentioned getting the environmental scientists, the political scientists, and the people who are providing immediate services, how they come together and actually look for a common solution, and that is also sustainable. I have a couple of questions that I would like to direct to the panel, and also if people from the audience would want to ask a question, you may please also participate. We came back in all the presentations and the panelists' remarks on improving the linkages between those who are displaced or in a refugee situation versus the host population, and the relationship and the effects they have mutually on each other. Do you see concentration and attention on improving these linkages through different basic service provision or through design and improvement of programming? This is going to be a viable strategy. Are there other accelerators that you can provide as an example that actually points out that this becomes more and more viable when we are planning solutions moving forward? May I, if I can start with Tarat, and then I can ask Sarah, Mesfin, and Ed to also contribute.
Okay, I don't really do a lot of work on host communities, so I'm not sure I'm fully equipped to answer that question, but I would imagine that it's important to engage with both communities in a way where they're actually working together rather than seen and pitched against each other, which is quite often the case, regardless of where you look in the world. Contexts like Uganda are quite exceptional. So the norm is where you see these two communities being pitched against each other, both politically and otherwise. So it's important to find a way to negotiate between the two, both from the perspective of the host government and also of the civil society members that are engaged in those contexts as well. So just a very broad thought on that.
Thank you, Tara. Sarah, your example actually identified the symbiotic exchanges between the host community and the displaced and the refugee population. Would you like to also comment on the viability of strategies that involve working towards getting the self-reliance on both host population and the refugee population?
Yeah, again, I don't know that I'm really qualified to comment on that. I'm mostly a researcher, and so I'm mostly interested in looking at the evidence. And I think that I would like to leave the policy to the policymakers, but I would also like to make a pitch for generating more evidence, which I think is a common theme that we've heard emerge throughout these discussions over the past couple of days.
Mesfin, your contribution.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I think as a humanitarian community, we have learned a lot in terms of how to serve displaced population. It's not good to set up a parallel system that isolates the host population just only for refugee or internal displaced. That creates conflict, and at the same time, the host population also by hosting displaced people, they are also equally vulnerable. So a response plan that takes into account the needs of both the displaced as well as the host is quite critical, and I think that's what we do as a humanitarian organization. And there are good examples, like one is, in the long-term types of, programming, take into account the national development plan of the country, so that when you are setting up permanent structure, whether it's a health facility or a water point, make sure that it is in a place where even if the displaced population live, which unlikely in most situations, but it will be used by the local population. So that kind of developmental mindset as we are setting up and planning, and also, not to introduce a new treatment protocol, new approaches, make sure that, we use a national, basically, policies to ensure that there is continuity of care. So there are, I think we have been much better off in terms of responding to displaced population, integrating the host with displaced, and I think there are many good examples that can be replicated. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ed, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think the trust and the confidence with your counterpart is extremely important. And again, with Luca, I agree. The period that these people should be from their own home village as short as possible. We have also seen in the reality there is a solidarity among people in Africa. People in need and people in need is a friend indeed. So you see that type of things also. But I agree that the government is officially the last resort. There is a lot of goodwill and support maybe from outside, but we cannot replace the government. And let's hope that those people who should be in the driving seat are the right people with the right conscience and do something for the service of the population. Otherwise, like in Asia, such a government will not last long. It will be replaced by another one.
Yeah. Thank you very much. May I request from anyone? Aya, please go ahead.
So I have both a comment and a question. I've been a very long time in the business, almost like all of you here, and spent a long time in the field. So just dividing a bit all the conversations and the topics we heard, we have refugee camps and settings that are very protracted, that have been going on for a very long time. And I believe both of you highlighted Uganda and Kenya, Kakuma, which we're talking about, Kakuma especially, many, many years, over 30 years. So looking at those camps and new camps that we heard, like the situation in Bangladesh, how is that different in how we approach it? Because if you look at host communities in Kakuma, it's no longer host communities or refugees. It's a very static situation with a lot of heavy political weight on it. And at the same time, if you look at the refugees coming out of Myanmar, it's also very heavy situation, third time displacement, but a whole different setting. So just a thought process on that. And on the same time, Yemen, because I did hear Yemen from my colleague from FAO highlighting the top crisis. I didn't hear it from IOM. And I was thinking, is it because it's a new type of displacement? They're not internally displaced, they're trapped because they have nowhere to go. And the bombardment is on the food system, yet the impact is catastrophic. So should we look at how we analyze that in terms of their needs and the response? Because it is true that the Middle East is a whole new area of conflict and need that we're not used to. It's totally conflict driven, but just a thought process on where do we put Yemen? How do we define that? And to what scale can we highlight their need? Thank you.
Any one of you would want to attempt the response? I was asked if I could take another question before the panelists can respond. So I have Purnima at the back.
Thank you for a very interesting session. My name is Purnima Kashyap and I represent the UN Network for Nutrition. I just wanted to hear from, I heard some good examples on the work that's being done with linking the humanitarian and development agenda. I often hear about the challenges, particularly, many challenges, but I wanted to touch particularly upon the challenges of financing between the humanitarian and development agendas. If I could get one example maybe from each or a couple of examples from across the board on how did you overcome those challenges, because we do recognize that financing from the donors comes in different compartments. How do you overcome the short-term funding for humanitarian versus the long-term and vice versa? Thank you.
Thank you, Purnima. One more question? We can take a question in threes. Please go ahead. Can you introduce yourself as well?
My name is Leah van Wezenbeek. I'm the director of the Amsterdam Center for World Food Studies. And what I miss, perhaps it's taking up also the point being made before, is the new dynamics we particularly see in the Middle East. I didn't hear anything about Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, or any other radical groups that to totally change the dynamics when we think about migration and the impact of migration to countries. We've worked in Jordan, and also Lebanon. And there we know that particularly Jordan is very afraid of destabilizing the country. So it's becoming really an issue how we can make sure that the young men, adolescent men, are not trapped into getting into these extreme narratives. So I understand this is a conference about nutrition, but we have talked about multisectoral approaches to nutrition. I just wonder if in the approaches you take, you have any, say, view on how to get those men involved in activities that will give them a brighter future, more or less.
Thank you very much. May I request, we have three questions. Two of them relate to the conflict situation and the new dynamics that creates migration and activities that are non-sustainable, and the entrapment in terms of Yemen as an example, and also humanitarian financing or the financing to strengthen humanitarian development peace nexus. Maybe I can take the same order as we are sitting here, starting with Ms. Van.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I'll try to answer a few of them. So just on the first point about the protracted versus the acute displacement setting, I think, they are different in some way. Our approach, I think Sarah talked about how the integration of Kalabia, for example, camp in Kenya, really, refugees basically integrating to the local for finding durable solution. That seemed to be, some of the emerging practice, but I think the acute displacement, usually, it's kind of the humanitarian, the, response types of need, which again, still need to take into account the needs of the host population. And the other thing is also, I think, an average displaced population to find a durable solution in a very short period of time is increasingly unlikely. I mean, average displacement now is almost 17 years. That means a life of a child, basically, who have grown up in a refugee camp. So I think, looking at education, for this group, because I think that's critical for their livelihood as well as their economic opportunity, and as well as, employment opportunities, giving them job. There are good examples, some countries that allow refugees to work, and the World Bank is using the new IDA financing really to incentivize countries to create job opportunities for refugees. So there are, good examples that are emerging, in terms of giving opportunities for displaced population. On the other one, on terms of Yemen, I don't work in Yemen, but I think I have some, knowledge about Yemen as well as Syria. I think from the IRC perspective, what we do is actually we work with our local partners. So like in Syria, there are so many, the health sector, Syrian medical doctors who are really willing to work and help their own people in very difficult contexts. I think, they don't have resource, with support, with external, they'll be able to meet the need. And I think we need to shift our approach of humanitarian response toward this local capacity development. And that's what the grand bargain is about, really, doing more of the humanitarian response through the local capacity building. So these are some of the thoughts, but I think I'll let my colleagues to speak on the others. Thank you.
So I, again, only feel qualified to respond to this question about the protracted versus acute situations. And admittedly, when Maria showed her slides of Bangladesh, I was completely overwhelmed and even depressed, thinking, how do we even begin to deal with this situation? And again, I'll go back to some of the remarks I made about Kakuma, and that is resilience is definitely about protecting refugees, but it is also about creating resilience among the host population. And I think that a lot of the political tension that had arisen between the host and refugee community around Kakuma came from the fact that the Turkana felt that they weren't receiving services and support to help them adjust to these massive refugee inflows. And so I would make an urge for policy looking at how we can help protect host communities. I also think to speak to what Mesfin was saying also about allowing access to labor markets. I think this is a huge issue that is not happening in enough refugee situations. And then finally, looking at the viability of cash transfers. So Daniel touched upon this as well. And to a certain extent, the program in Calabier has been trying to introduce a kind of a cash transfer system, but it's very dysfunctional. And I think often we have this stigma against poor people in that if we give them cash, they're not going to use it right. And I just think if you look at the empirical evidence on cash transfers, that's just completely false. And so.
Just to go one by one, on Yemen, I can't speak to the practicalities of programming there, which I think was really your key question. Just in sort of in relationship to the next question too, in terms of the humanitarian and the long-term development aspects of that particular issue, it's really it's key that one port is so responsible for so much of the food and water resources that come into that country, and it's important to take that into account in terms of our long-term development programming, that we are very conscious of these potential bottlenecks in global food transport, but global and local, in fact, where this is precisely the kind of problem that this can lead to, where one blockade can cause such severe problems in a country or in a particular region. And of course, the immediate humanitarian impact of that as well. On the funding issues, I don't work with the sort of contrast between humanitarian development funding, but what I do know working with sort of donor development funding is that timeframes are always a massive issue. To have to show impact when you've got, say, a 5-year funding for a 5-year program is incredibly challenging. So again, we kind of have, it comes back to a political issue of needing to show an impact, and 5 years is not always a lot of time to show that impact, particularly in situations of conflict or of immediate natural disasters and such. So we are going to have to keep having this conversation about how to resolve funding versus the evidence that will hopefully either lead to new funding or sustained funding, et cetera. Because to be honest, this is not an issue that I've come across a good resolution for, because you do have to be accountable. You do have to show impact for the kind of thing we do. But the timeframes we're working with are often very limited. On the terrorism and the Middle East politics aspect of things, I think this gets back to mental health issues a lot of the time. We're talking about addressing the relationship between men and women, between men and livelihoods, between women and livelihoods, etc. This comes down to being able to engage with populations without dehumanizing them. And that's a difficult thing to do. There's a fine balance between patronizing people and telling them what they should feel versus actually engaging with them and giving them agency and allowing them to attain agency without feeling that you're giving it to them. So it's an issue of attitudes there. I do think that in the context where I've analyzed terrorism, say in places like Bangladesh, which have recently become sort of more part of the international, have become more on the radar of international terrorism and sort of extremist conflict. It's not, the relationship between poverty and or extreme vulnerability the connection between that and terrorism is not entirely firm or convincing. So it's important to not conflate the two necessarily, and keep that in mind. Though we are going off on a bit of a tangent away from nutrition, so I'll let my colleague go on.
Thank you. We know the humanitarian crisis is dramatic in that part of the world, and I would strongly encourage that we tell our friends in FAO and IFPRI that maybe think about it and what we can do on the next occasion to go a bit deeper, because we have not the time now. But you are right, it needs attention, and I hope one day, between now and 5 years, that the dust is down and that we can think about policies, investments. There is a lot to do. One practical thing how we can, as community, do a helping hand is, I remember always the peace boat in Congo. The Congo was divided in 3 parts, and we took with the UN, on the helm was Mr. Swing, he was the head of the UN there, with the embassies, with the UN, and we went to the 3 parts where we want to send humanitarian goods to the northern of Congo, and we need food back for Kinshasa, because people were starving there. And it succeeded, and we were able that the parties went around the table and started to talk about it. So sometimes creative ideas, creativity from our side can help. But for Middle East, you are right. That is the finger on the wound, and a lot of work has to be done. And let's hope that things will be for the better the coming 5 years.
Thank you very much. I see that Maria wanted to have a short intervention. This will be the last point before we close the session. We are 7 minutes almost late. Thank you.
Yes. Is it on? Is it on? I just, because you were so specific. I just wanted to explain that I work in the regional office for IOM, and then I use my regional lenses covering the crisis in this region. IOM is very much involved in the Middle East, very much involved in Yemen, but also in other crises. We have in the world numerous places where we have very complex crises with mixed migration elements, which makes it even more complicated, further to those in the Middle East, but also in Venezuela, for instance. But that will be a whole different conference and a different session. So I just wanted to explain, yes, we're working there. Yes, there is an understanding of the complexities of those contexts, but I was just focusing on the region.
Thank you very much, Maria. I know that there may be more questions than answers, and the presenters and the panelists identified examples of accelerators and what could be done more. We know that we still have issues that are not resolved in terms of financing the humanitarian development peace nexus and how strategies are developed that straddle the continuum between the humanitarian development and peace. We also know that short time frames, government policies that may or may not support displaced people around the world and refugees, and also finding durable solutions for them is still something that are very context specific, and resolutions and legislations and actions are continuing to be made to improve the situation of those who are displaced around the world. Thank you very much for being here. I would like to especially thank Luca, Dan, and Maria for your presentations, and the panelists, Mesman, Sarah, Tarat, and Ed. Thank you very much and have a good day. Bye-bye.